All right. Well, good morning. Thank you very much for being here and, more importantly, being on time. When House Democrats passed their House operating rules at the start of this legislative session, we were all told how they would serve to make the chamber, in their eyes, more fair, more bipartisan, and raise up the voices of the members in each of their individual districts. Now, as you've heard us say repeatedly, that functioning has been an abysmal failure. As a consequence, we have one of the most partisan-run floors in modern history of this institution. But today, House Republicans are announcing a way that we can, in fact, try and start to reverse the tide and move, more important, bipartisan legislation that can be moved that has been bottled up in committee for too long. Today, we are announcing our intention to use the House Committee discharge resolution process to bring to the House a floor vote for a constitutional amendment to require voter identification at every election. Under the current House rules, which allegedly were designed to end the practice of holding up bipartisan bills in committee, you now need 25 members from each caucus to sign a discharge petition before it will be brought up for a vote. Thankfully, we already know 22 Democrats have voted in favor of voter identification at every election. Earlier this year, their names are on that poster. Representative Ecker and Cutts introduced their own voter ID constitutional amendment in early April of last year. For nearly a year, that legislation has sat in committee. And that's despite poll after poll telling us that requiring identification to vote at each and every election is supported on a broad and bipartisan basis. Common sense tells us that more and more proposals, including the one introduced last week by House Democrats, are introduced to make our elections harder to administer and less secure, and that simply requiring a state-provided identification at each election is the best way to enhance election security. Time is of the essence. The 2024 general election is going to be one of the highest turnout elections in Pennsylvania history. Putting a voter identification constitutional amendment on the ballot for this November guarantees that the most voices have a say in this very important issue, more than likely any other time in the next few years. But to do that, we must get the Ecker-Cutts constitutional amendment through the General Assembly by early July. Those that remember the constitutional amendment process know that it has to be 90 days prior to the election that is advertised. So between now and then, we'll have a lot of important votes and a lot of important decisions to make. But I couldn't agree more when my counterpart in the Senate, Majority Leader Pittman, said last week, a lot can happen if we get voter ID on as a constitutional amendment. 22 Democrats have already voted to support ID requirements at every election. We need just three more reasonable Democrats to come forward to join us in this overwhelmingly bipartisan push to get this important constitutional amendment out of committee and onto the floor for a vote. Let's see what we can do under these House rules. If we work together to move a proven bipartisan proposal forward, perhaps that will be the first of many successes. Thank you. Now I will introduce our State Government Committee Chairman, Representative Roy.
Thank you, Mr. Leader. If your polling site is at a library, I would like to give you a reminder. If all you will be doing on Election Day is voting, you don't need an ID to prove who you are. But if you plan to sign out a library book after you vote, they won't let you unless you have an ID. There are stronger rules in place for signing out a Curious George book for your kids than there is for voting. That seems really backwards. Elections are so important, we should be making sure that people that vote are who they say they are. I am very frustrated as the chair of the State Government Committee that we have not acted on this very important election security issue. House Bill 891, which mandates ID to vote, has been in the State Government Committee for almost a year. A national poll has showed that 80% of voters support it. That includes 62% of Democrats. So this isn't a partisan issue. This has very broad, widespread support. It's equally frustrating that this session, half of the legislation passed so far out of State Government Committee has done absolutely nothing to help Pennsylvania residents. We've passed 74 pieces of legislation out of state government. 37 of them did nothing other than name things. There have been 31 symbolic resolutions to name certain days, certain weeks, and certain months after different things. And there's been 6 bills to name new state holidays and new state symbols. But none of those things actually help make our lives better. I will be introducing a discharge resolution this week to bring House Bill 891 to the floor. This very meaningful piece of legislation by Representative Eckert and Representative Kutz deserves a vote on the House floor. This is an opportunity for us to do something that the vast majority of the public supports. You hear about people wanting more bipartisanship in the General Assembly, where here we have an issue that 80% of the public agrees with. So we will be doing that discharge resolution this week. I'm now honored to introduce one of the prime sponsors of the bill, which is Representative Eckert.
Thank you, Chairman Roy. Voter ID has been a major topic of discussion for many years in Pennsylvania. And it's no wonder that polls have consistently shown that there is widespread bipartisan support. Republicans, Democrats, and independents have consistently asked for voter ID. The right to vote is the very heart of our elections and our democracy, and it's vital to ensure the integrity and fairness of our elections. Voter ID laws give strength, reliability, and trustworthiness to our electoral process. 15 different ID options are already available and for those to be able to use for voter ID. And financial barriers have been addressed by making free ID cards available to those that qualify. And remember, Pennsylvania already has a voter ID law. The first time you go to a precinct, the first time you go to vote, you need to provide voter ID. This legislation just enhances and strengthens what we already have. Forms of identification are required from everything from banking to, as Chairman Roy said, getting a library card. And I believe it is common sense to require them at our polls. However, on such a crucial issue, the only opinion that matters are the citizens of Pennsylvania. It is time to give them the opportunity to vote on the issue themselves through a voter referendum that puts the decision directly in the people of Pennsylvania's hands. Let us come today to support the discharge resolution so that we can give voters the ability to implement a positive change in our elections. And as somebody who won an election by one vote, that one vote is important. And if one case of fraud or one instance of election integrity is in jeopardy, that can make a difference in an election. At this time, I'm going to turn it over to my good friend, Representative Kutz.
Good morning. The legislators you see before you today are committed to ensuring Pennsylvania's elections are free, fair, safe, and secure. We stand united to advocate for enhanced election security to ensure public trust in the Commonwealth's elections. And we see voter ID as a bipartisan, common sense path forward to achieving that goal. Every eligible person in Pennsylvania and in the nation has the right to vote. They should also be able to exercise that right freely and with confidence that their vote counts. They should have no reservations about being potentially misrepresented by a discrepancy in the system. Voter ID is an easy way to ensure eligibility, not unlike the ID cards we all show at a doctor's office or a bank. An ID is required for many of the things we buy and do. Not to mention, voter ID has a 74% approval rating in Pennsylvania. Our citizens should have the opportunity to enshrine this measure in our Constitution. When this legislation was considered last year, 22 House Democrats voted in favor, demonstrating bipartisan support not only in polls but in the legislature as well. The time to carry the torch forward is now. If the General Assembly can act promptly to pass House Bill 891, Pennsylvania voters may be empowered as early as the November general election to make big decisions about electoral protocol in our state. Our voters, our constituents, should have the ultimate say in deciding if identification should be required. Our legislation would allow for photo and non-photo IDs to be accepted, making sure that no one who is eligible to vote will be barred from obtaining identification. That's very important. We also support making ID cards free so that cost is not an obstacle to vote either. If Pennsylvanians are to have complete faith in the election system, they must have complete confidence elections are conducted safely and securely. Voter ID looks to the future of elections, and I look forward to advocating for this constitutional amendment for current and future Pennsylvania voters. I'll now turn it back to our leader, Brian Cutler. Thank you.
Thank you, Representative Cutts. Questions? It was last session was when they brought it up, the House Democrats. They announced it from the floor 2 different times. I'll have Jason get you the specific dates.
What are we hoping to accomplish? We already, as you mentioned, have voter ID laws in place. By requiring this at every election, what are the things that you're trying to implement safety-wise for elections?
This is an issue that, one, consistently comes up in the voter support, as evidenced by the polling, and not only the polling, but the votes. 22 of the Democrats who are to my left here have already voted for it. So that's the goal, is to work through that process and provide a consistent system that the voters have asked for. The difficulty, obviously, is getting it through the constitutional amendment process. It passed last session as Senate Bill 106 with a good margin of votes, and then would be ripe to be considered this time, as long as it's passed prior to July, that it could in fact be on the upcoming election in November of 2024. The concern that we heard on the Emergency Powers Amendment was that not enough people voted, there wasn't high enough turnout. I think that we would all agree that there will likely be not just record, but historic turnout in terms of the upcoming election. And so I think that's a great time. So what we're really up against, quite frankly, is the timeline. No, I mean, you feel free to ask all of them, because even some people who didn't vote for it, I think, liked other provisions in it. And I think it's important. And this is something that the people behind me that were here last session have already voted for. We voted and included it in House Bill 1300. I think that Governor Wolf too quickly dismissed that bill because it had a whole host of election reforms in it that, quite frankly, the public had requested. And voter ID was one of them. And I think, and I'll defer any specific questions, but I was conferring with Chairman Grove. I think it had 3 different versions of a free ID. Plus, if worse came to worse, you could sign an affidavit saying that you were, in fact, who you said you were. So I think we addressed all the concerns from the prior version that the Supreme Court had thrown out because we provided for those individuals who are eligible to vote, they have a mechanism by which they can do so, and do so without adversely charging them or causing undue burden, which was the test that the Supreme Court put before us. So, yeah.
On the language of the constitutional amendment, is that public? Is it?
Yep, it's the same as last session.
Have you been in communication with the Department of State? Because it will be the Department of State that handles these issues with the actual public notices and legal requirements.
Yeah, unfortunately, and it's a great question, because you've asked about the Department of State, which many people might remember messed up one of the advertisings for a constitutional amendment on the statute of limitations. So that is very important, but I don't think you put the cart before the horse. You got to get it through the chamber. But the good news is it's the exact same bill that passed previously, so they've had more than ample notice from dating back to last session, quite frankly, that it is in fact there and they know what it is.
Have you been in communication with local county election officials?
Well, as was pointed out previously, voter ID is already part of the process for new voters. When we worked on any voting changes previously, we were in communication not just with local county officials all across the Commonwealth, but we also discussed it with each political party from their individual perspectives, what that would mean on their primary systems. These changes have been thoroughly vetted and, more importantly, supported by many folks previously. So when you look at that, that'll be part of the ongoing discussion. Yep.
How common is fraudulent impersonation at the polls in the past couple of years?
Well, actually, there's an Inspector General's report from New York City which detailed they actually did a sting, and they had some particular cases. The problem is you're actually proving a negative. You've got to prove that somebody was in fact not who they said they were. And absent ID, that becomes a difficult challenge. So, and Chairman Grove, I know, has some additional, he did 30 hours of hearings, I think, on it. But it does in fact happen. I'd point to the Philadelphia case where you had the judge of elections down there who was recently barred from being a judge of elections because they were routinely stuffing the ballot box by signing other people's names.
There was a major federal indictment of Philadelphia election workers. It stemmed from a pay-to-play scheme where a political consultant would pay election directors to basically stuff the ballot books. Voter ID would help in those cases to verify each individual coming to the poll. Right now, voter information is public data. If you know that a voter has voted once and is not a consistent voter at all, you could walk in, because we have a very transient society. This is we got to remember, our election law is predicated in 1937 agrarian time where everybody knew everybody and nobody moved. That is not today's society. So you have a transient society of which those poll workers may not know those new individuals coming in. And you could walk in there and say, hi, I am Seth Grove. They wouldn't do that. My poll workers obviously know me. But I could walk in there and let's say Seth Grove voted the first time. There's no verification process. I walk up, you see this kind of fudge. They're not signature experts. You can go vote. You can exploit the system by doing that. It's a loophole we're trying to close. We know it has occurred in mass in Philadelphia. So we have the Inspector General's report in New York. So it is a loophole. It's a known loophole. All we're just trying to do is provide some efficient members to close that and ensure that no one is disenfranchised at all.
Yeah, Brad.
Go ahead.
Also, just in case anybody missed it, Representative Ecker won by 1 vote. Representative Cook, I thought I saw Bud, was it 11 votes? 11 won by 11 votes. So it wouldn't take that many people who are not really who they say they are to vote in an election and change the outcome. And you have to remember, this also applies to local elections. There are many, many township supervisor elections, school board, township auditor, things like that, where the margin of victory is a tie, and they flip a coin to see who wins. So every vote matters. We have to make sure every voter is who they say they are.
Yeah, I'll give you another good example. It doesn't correlate directly to voting, but I think it does highlight some of the absurdity, quite frankly. I couldn't advertise on Facebook until I provided, from the campaign side, until I provided my IRS letter to show that I was, in fact, my taxpayer EIN was what it said it was, and I was who I said I was. You can't buy drugs in a drugstore. You can't check out a library book. You can't do a variety of things without showing identification. Many times, and I'd point this out, the Democrats with their national convention required ID to get on the floor. Let's stop and think about that for a minute. So, the reality is we all provide ID all the time, except in this one case, which, as Chairman Roy pointed out, could in fact be influenced. If you had that Philadelphia fraud case that we outlined happen in either Representative Cook's or Representative Ecker's districts, those results could have been different. So it is important. Any other questions? All right, we'll be available for individuals, and thank everybody for coming, and more importantly, the important focus on this issue. Thank you.